So, Spider-Man No Way Home is just around the corner, and if the leaks are right, it will be the biggest Spider-Man crossover ever since Into the Spider-Verse. Saying that people are hyped is an understatement, with people literally fighting each other in order to get the tickets for the premiere and the right to spoil the film to the rest of the internet. But how did we get here? In this video, I would like to take you on a journey through all of the films and the drama that ensued in order for these films to take place. Also, I'm making this video before watching the film, so if anyone is gonna be pissed if 3 Tom Hollands show up in the screen, it's gonna be me. With that being said, let's get started. In 1962, after the success of Fantastic Four, Marvel Comics editor, head writer, and absolute legend Stan Lee was looking for a new superhero idea. He said that the idea for Spider-Man came from the desire to create a character with whom teens could actually identify. There is some debate as who technically created Spider-Man, some even deriving in lawsuits. However, the general consensus is that Stan Lee gave the premise of a teenager bitten by a spider and developing powers to Steve Ditko, who would then expand upon this concept, creating the now famous costume alongside the web gimmick on the wrist and spider signal. Also, that's what Wikipedia says, so I'm just gonna stick with it. Initially, Lee found some resistance from Marvel's publisher at the time, Martin Woodman. In an interview, Lee would recall the next conversation he had with Woodman. Eventually, Goodman agreed to include Spider-Man in what would be the first issue of the science fiction and supernatural anthology series, Amazing Adult Fantasy, which was renamed Amazing Fantasy for that single issue. And so, Spider-Man would make its first appearance to the world on the cover of Amazing Fantasy number 15 on August 1962. A few months later, Woodman reviewed the sales figures for that issue and was shocked to find that the Spider-Man issue was actually one of Marvel's highest-selling comics at the time. A solo series would follow with the release of the Amazing Spider-Man number 1, cover dated 1963, and well, the rest is history. Despite the success of the character in the comics, Marvel had a hard time translating that success into other media forms. Now, this was more of a problem with Marvel that at the time, unlike their rivals at DC, seemed like they would never be able to make a good superhero film.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
The early days of Spider-Man cinematic history have some ties with Sony, with Columbia Pictures Television as well as Columbia Pictures editing packages of the episodes from the 70s The Amazing Spider-Man TV show, and releasing them as 3 films that would only be released outside the US. Spider-Man in 1977, Spider-Man Strikes Back in 1978, and Spider-Man The Dungeons Challenge in 1981. Although the TV show earned good ratings, the CBS television network cancelled it after just 2 seasons, along with Wonder Woman, to avoid being labeled as the superhero network. During this time, Marvel paired with Japanese company Toei in order to create a Spider-Man live-action tokusatsu series for television that would get to be known in the West as Spider-Man, or as I like to call it, the best Spider-Man live-action TV show. I mean, the footage here really speaks for itself, and now I'm gonna be pissed if he or Leopardon don't show up in the film, so I hope Marvel is keeping track of this. Also, this is Spider-Man TV opening, certified banger.
Hey, 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 wow.
The first proper attempt at bringing Spider-Man to the big screen would come from producer Roger Corman, who was the first person to hold an option on the Spider-Man property and began developing the film at Orion Pictures. Stan Lee was brought into the project to write a screenplay which featured Cold War themes and Dr. Octopus as the main antagonist. However, the project would not follow through due to budgetary disputes between Corman and Lee. In 1985, Canon Films bought their film rights for Spider-Man for only $225,000. Leslie Stevens was hired by Canon to write a script that featured Peter Parker as an ID badge photographer who becomes subject to a mad scientist experiment which transforms him into a human tarantula. Stan Lee was not impressed with the script and asked for a rewrite, so that same year Ted Newsom and John Brancato gave it a go. This script would be the one to get the closest to production out of all of the pre-Sony scripts. Joseph Zito was selected as director, with Tom Cruise as potential Peter Parker and a budget of $15 to $20 million assigned to the project. Everything was going great until the critical and financial failure of Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, and Masters of the Universe, which were produced by Canon. Naturally, the budget for a Spider-Man movie was cut to only $7 million. Zito wasn't willing to make the film on a budget, so he stepped down as the director and the project would be finally cancelled following Canon's acquisition by Pathé. Menahem Golan, a former executive at Canon, extended his option on the Spider-Man film during his tenure as CEO of 20th Century Film Corporation. This would result in James Cameron getting hired to write a script for a potential Spider-Man film in 1993, and apparently there's even a joke that got caught from Into the Spider-Verse that references this entire situation. In the meantime, Marvel was going through some financial difficulties that led the company to file for bankruptcy in 1989. Not everything was bad though, as one of the Marvel lawyers realized that Canon had never registered the sale of the film rights with the US Copyright Office, which meant that Marvel could get the rights for Spider-Man back for free. Desperate for cash, Marvel offered Sony Pictures the film rights of many lesser-known comic book characters at the time. Sony declined this offer, which included the rights for Iron Man, Thor, Black Panther, Ant-Man, and others for only $25 million. Eventually, however, Sony purchased the film rights for Spider-Man for only $70 million. It was during this time that Marvel sold the film rights to some of its more recognizable superheroes to multiple studios. Iron Man went to New Line Cinema, Hulk to Universal Pictures, and X-Men, Fantastic Four, and Deadpool to 20th Century Fox. One key aspect of the deal was that Sony kept the rights for Spider-Man films as long as they continued to produce a Spider-Man movie every 5 years. Sony of course didn't waste time and began development on what would become the first US theatrical release of the beloved character. In April 1999, Sony Pictures managed to retrieve all preceding script versions of a Spider-Man film, however they ended up only using the Cameron material. This material became the basis of David Kopp's first drafted screenplay, with Electro and Sandman remaining as main antagonists of the film. Kopp's subsequent rewrites substituted the Green Goblin as the main antagonist and added Dr. Octopus as secondary antagonist. Sam Raimi, who got selected to direct the film in January 2000, felt the Green Goblin and the father-son dynamic between Norman Osborn and Peter Parker would be more interesting. Thus, he dropped Dr. Octopus from the film. Funny enough, one aspect that survived all the rewrites was Cameron's idea of the organic web shooter, as for some reason, Raimi felt that he would stretch the audience's suspension of disbelief too far to have Peter invent the mechanical web shooters. And so, on May 3rd, 2002, the first ever Spider-Man movie got released in the US, and it became both a critical and financial success. It was the first film to pass the $100 million mark in a single weekend, establishing a new opening weekend record. As expected, a sequel was shortly announced. The entire cast returned for the sequel, adding Alfred Molina as the main villain of the film, Dr. Otto Octavius, aka Dr. Octopus. Raimi decided to make the film about Peter struggling to keep up with his responsibilities as a Spider-Man, as his own life was falling apart. The movie would go on to surpass its predecessor in every way, making almost 4 times its budget and getting overall acclaim by critics and fans. Legendary film critic Roger Ebert, who gave the original film 2.5 stars out of 4, gave the sequel 4 stars out of 4, calling it the best superhero film since the modern genre was introduced with Superman in 1978. At this point, Sony was making money hands over fist and immediately greenlit a third film. Spider-Man 3 began development immediately, with Ivan Raimi writing a treatment for the film in just 2 months. The film would serve as a way to explore Peter learning that he is not a sinless vigilante, and that there can be some humanity in those that he considered criminals, with Harry Osborn and Sandman as the main villains, as he felt they would perfectly tie to Peter through the main theme of the film, which was forgiveness. Raimi wanted to add the Vulture as a third villain, played by Sir Ben Kingsley, but the character got dropped. Producers then started pressing Raimi to include Venom in the film, since they were receiving large amounts of fan mail asking for the character to make an appearance. Raimi didn't like Venom since he felt that character lacked humanity, and it didn't connect thematically as well as the other 2 villains to Peter. Raimi ended up accepting after producer Avi Arad pointed out that the films relied too much on Raimi's personal favorite Spider-Man villains, and not the characters that fans were actually interested in. Screenwriter Alvin Sargent found the script to be so complex that he considered dividing it into 2 films, but abandoned the idea after he could not create a successful intermediate climax to make the cut. The film premiered in the US theaters on May 4, 2007. Earning $894 million worldwide and becoming the highest grossing film for both the trilogy and Columbia Pictures at the time, until the release of Skyfall in 2012. Despite the financial success, the film was met with harsh criticism. from both fans and critics, currently holding a 63% approval on Rotten Tomatoes. Sam Raimi himself would later call the movie awful, and producer Avi Arad eventually accepted his part in the mess for pushing Raimi to include Venom in the film. Despite the negative reviews, both a fourth and a fifth film were greenlit, with the studio even considering the possibility of shooting both films in tandem. This time, however, production was not as smooth as it previously was, with Raimi now being reluctant to take input from the producers as he felt that led to the disaster that was Spider-Man 3. An example of this was Raimi's desire to introduce the Vulture as the main villain, but Sony pushing for the Lizard to become the main antagonist. As development continued, Raimi realized that he would not be able to have the script ready to meet the planned May 6, 2011 release date and stepped down as director. In January 2010, Sony announced that they were already working on rebooting the franchise with a new film set to be released in 2012. The silver lining was that Sony learned its lesson and would never tamper with any of the scripts going further.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
Now, these films have been analyzed to death. That being said, here are my 2 cents on the film. I believe that if you want to nitpick these movies to death and have a really good time doing it, you can do that. And if you want to convince people that these films are some sort of cinematic masterpiece, there is plenty of material for you to do that as well. I tend to fall somewhere in the middle. I believe that these films, just as those old racist cartoons indicate at the beginning, should be viewed as products of their time. These films would not hold up by today's standards, except for maybe Spider-Man 2. But something important to remember is that today's standards would not exist without these films. Whether you like them or not, these films alongside the X-Men franchise showed studios that there was money to be made with superhero films, if they took them seriously and they were willing to take risks with new talent.